You're listening to Sports Connections with David Smale, the show that brings you a fun and intimate look into connections throughout sports. Now here's your host, David Smale.
On December 16, 2020, Major League Baseball announced that statistics from the Negro Baseball Leagues would be recognized as official Major League stats. It was the latest affirmation of the Negro Leagues as Major League, something that the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum has been saying for more than 25 years. Our guest today, Bob Kendrick, has been the president of the museum for almost 10 years. The best-dressed man in Kansas City is the man with the smiling face who greets you when you can come to tour the museum at the 18th and Vine District in Kansas City. He's also the best storyteller in Kansas City, especially when the subject is baseball and the Negro Leagues. He's an ambassador not only for the museum, but for Kansas City in general. And it's fair to say he's an ambassador for the sport of baseball. He is passionate about his job and about the history of the Negro Leagues. And I dare you to have a bad day when any part of that day includes chatting with Bob. Bob, welcome to Sports Connections.
David, it's a pleasure, man. Thanks for having me.
Well, let's just jump into the news that I started with here. What was your reaction when hearing the news that Major League Baseball would recognize the stats from the Negro Leagues?
Well, fortunately for me, I had a little time to process it. I was aware of this as it was being developed and fleshed out by Major League Baseball. I appreciate the fact that they clued me in on what their plans were and then ultimately had me involved when the press release and the announcement took place. So I had some time to kind of reconcile and pull my emotions together. Naturally, I was elated the day of the announcement. And it's such exciting news, and the historical significance of what this represents is monumental. It's rare in any walk of life that people are willing to say, hey, I was wrong.
Yeah.
And I want to make amends. It's hard to do that in our day-to-day relationships.
Yeah.
And so for baseball to come back years after this blatant dismissal by this committee, to be frank, that I knew absolutely nothing about. I didn't know anything about that 1969 committee that had basically dismissed the Negro Leagues as being a major league and had recognized these other leagues that really, David, had no impact whatsoever on the game at any significant level, and certainly not on Major League Baseball, whereas this league that had been dismissed had tremendous impact on Major League Baseball. And so I didn't know about this committee. And so once I found out about it, and then there was, kind of this kind of swirl around, okay, what is Major League Baseball going to do? Are they going to do anything? And for the better part, Major League Baseball had been pretty quiet on that front until they were prepared to address it. And so when I did find out and when it was going to happen, I was very excited. It was a proud day for all of us who called the Negro Leagues home.
Were you involved in the process at all? Were you, not negotiation, that sounds like a give and take thing, but were you involved in the process? Did they ask you your opinion or any of that?
No, not as much as the nuts and bolts of it. They had worked with this group of historians to kind of iron out and see if they could collect the necessary quantitative data that would be needed to base anything on statistics. And again, I caution everyone, you can never just kind of diminish the Negro Leagues to just statistics. Statistics will never tell the complete story of the Negro Leagues. And so for me, they are more contextual in nature than anything else. And it was needed data in order to get us to that date, that historic date. And so, but I let them handle that situation and deal with the folks who understand. I was never very good at probability or statistics. And so I stayed away from that class in college. and so I stayed away from this situation as well and let those who knew exactly what they were doing do it. Now, again, nitpicking, I thought they could have gone into the early 50s, as a cutoff date. But I can't really have any qualms about the 1948 cutoff date, although, again, I thought by the early 1950s, there were still a number of star players coming out of the Negro Leagues. And really by 1948, you only had 7 players who had made it into the major leagues, 5 that go up in 1947, and then, of course, Satchel and Roy Campanella in 1948. And so there were still many stars who were coming out of the Negro Leagues, and the leagues were still going. The East Coast teams died almost the minute that Jackie Robinson was signed. But the Midwestern teams were still drawing quite well, throughout that process. So I thought they could have gone into the 50s. But, like I said, I have no qualm with 1948.
It's interesting, when I've been promoting this podcast, I will say I don't have a take. I'm just interviewing people in sports and getting their opinions, but I'm going to break my own rule here. I have a take. I think this is essential in baseball history to include the Negro Leagues, because we know that, they were unofficial, but barnstorming games between Negro Leagues All-Stars and Major League Baseball All-Stars and the Negro League All-Stars more than held their own. No one can say that Negro Leagues Baseball was worse than Major League Baseball. It might have been different, but it was not minor.
You can't say that with any level of authority, because, again, here was a league that even pre-integration, you got to remember, David, that they were renting major league ballparks, and they were filling up those major league ballparks. Mm-hmm. And the major league teams were getting a percentage of the gate and likely all of the concession from this league that was considered less than, and yet they were outdrawing many of those major league teams.
Yeah.
And then when you get to integration, 1947, and Jackie Robinson opens the door for others to now move into the major leagues, Black and Hispanic players to now move into the major leagues, this tremendous pipeline of talent that was siphoned from the Negro Leagues. Again, this league that was considered less than, and yet this amazing talent that was perhaps the largest kind of, pool of talent that Major League Baseball ever saw at one time in the history of its league. Again, from this league that was somehow considered less than.
Yeah.
So that committee that made that decision, it was complete dismissal. This was racially motivated. It had nothing to do with factuality or actuality. It was just the fact that we're not going to recognize those brothers. Those brothers didn't exist.
Yeah.
And it was a shame, but to Commissioner Manfred's credit, he came back and rectified that as best as he possibly could. And anytime that Major League Baseball does something, it is always kind of assessed with skepticism.
Yeah.
There's always this question of, okay, they must have an ulterior motive. And as I've said on many occasions, and we've heard this expression many times before, it is always the right time to do the right thing.
Yeah.
And Commissioner Manfred did what others could have done and didn't do.
Yeah.
Irregardless of whatever people might think the motivation was. And the thing that I was so cautious of, and I wanted to help people understand, that the Negro League players, they were very self-assured. They knew how good they were. Mm-hmm. They knew how good their league was. And quite frankly, David, the major leaguers knew how good they were.
Yeah.
And so they never sought validation from anyone. Now, these were very proud athletes. They were never seeking validation. They let the game speak for itself.
Yeah.
But in some ways, this is historical validation for what they were able to do in the face of adversity, to build this enterprise. And so this is atonement. It is acknowledgement. It is a reckoning, and that's the important aspect of what this means, at least in my eyes.
Yeah. And I think what I'm hearing you say in the fact that the players didn't seek justification was summarized in what Buck used to say. And you obviously knew him way better than I did, but I had the privilege of getting to know him pretty well late in his life. He would say, don't pity me for not being able to play Major League Baseball. Pity the people who didn't get to watch me because I wasn't allowed to play baseball. He knew that the Negro Leagues were putting out top level baseball players and baseball games. And it was to the detriment of the people who didn't get to see them, not to the players who didn't get to play in the major leagues.
And that was their mindset.
Yeah.
That was their mindset. Don't feel sorry for me. Feel sorry for the people who didn't see me play, because they're the ones that missed out.
Yeah. Obviously, you're in your office now, so we can't do a visual tour, but I want you to just give us an audio tour of the museum. I've been there quite a few times, but for someone who hasn't been there, and I will say right now, shame on you, what are some of the highlights? What are the things as you're doing tours? And I know you don't do tours all day long. You've got a job, but every chance you get, you do tours with people. What are some of the things?
I do, and it's one of the favorite parts of what I do. I enjoy interacting with our guests when they come, and I think the most difficult thing for me as part of this pandemic that we've been enduring is that it has lessened my ability to interact with people the way that I was accustomed to. I was used to getting down and telling stories and hugging and high-fiving and taking pictures with people, and COVID has kind of not allowed us to do that kind of interaction. But, whenever I'm giving a tour, we always stop when we come through the turnstiles. And as I tell people all the time, you've in essence walked into an old ballpark. And when you walk into the ballpark, the first thing you see is the field. And of course, here is the Field of Legends. And the Field of Legends, I think, is one of the most amazing displays in any museum anywhere in the world. Now, obviously, I'm biased, but it is so amazing. And it is, I've seen people move to tears when they get to the field. And the Field of Legends features 10 life-size bronze sculptures of Negro League greats, and they are cast in position as if they were playing a game. Well, the 10 that adorn the field are 10 of the first group of Negro Leaguers to be inducted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame at Cooperstown. So that's how our all-star team was chosen. And then, as you well know, on the outside looking in, almost poetically, is the late, great Buck O'Neil, who is managing this great all-star team. And so you peer through this chicken wire backstop. And of course, chicken wire itself is symbolic of American segregation. See, during that era, if Black fans were allowed in to watch a major league game, that is how we were oftentimes separated. So Black fans would sit down the left or the right field lines. We would be separated from white fans with a chicken wire barrier. We used that same chicken wire to separate all of our guests from the centerpiece of our exhibition. And so basically, you have to learn their story before you can take the field. So we intentionally segregate our guests from the field. And so by the time you've bared witness to everything that they had to endure just to play baseball, then the very last thing that happens here is now you can take the field. And in many respects, David, you're now deemed worthy to walk out on the field with 10 of the baddest brothers to ever play this game. And it's a kind of a nostalgic journey back in time. It is told on a timeline of American history. So really it becomes an all-encompassing history lesson. You not only come here and witness the rise and subsequent fall of the Negro Leagues, but you also witness the social rise of America simultaneously. And of course, those two things go hand in hand.
I've heard you say many times that baseball, and specifically the Negro Leagues, played a huge role in integration of American society, and it played a huge role in people of my race accepting people of your race as equals. That baseball was not only baseball didn't ride the social changes coattails. It's almost the other. Baseball let society on its own coattails.
It really did. And we make the bold assertion that Jackie Robinson's breaking of the color barrier wasn't just a part of the civil rights movement, David, it was the beginning of the civil rights movement in this country. This is 1947. And as I oftentimes relate to our visitors, this is well before those more noted civil rights occurrences.
Right.
So this is before Brown versus the Board of Education. This is before Rosa Parks' refusal to move to the back of the bus.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., as Buck O'Neill would so eloquently say, was only a sophomore at Morehouse College when Jackie signed his contract to play in the Dodgers organization. Our very own President Truman would not integrate the armed forces until a year after Jackie.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
for all intents and purposes, this is what indeed started the ball of social progress rolling in our country, baseball. And you're right, our country literally jumped on the coattail of baseball. And so while baseball itself had been vilified for not allowing blacks to play, when it opened its door, our country followed suit.
Yeah.
And David, I think it speaks to the reverence that baseball held and still to a large degree still holds in our society. It was America's national pastime. It was the game. And so these other sports were in existence, and actually the NFL had integrated before Major League Baseball, but nobody was paying football or basketball any attention.
Right.
It was all about baseball.
I know that there's not a lot of new history. That's kind of an oxymoron, but new history, especially with the museum. But it seems like there's always new exhibits. There's always new ways to tell the story. How often do you get to update? Because I know every single time I'm there, and I'll bet I've been through a dozen times, maybe more. I bet every single time I go through there, I learn something new. How often do you get to update what's the exhibit in the museum?
Not nearly enough as I would like to, but we're constantly challenging ourselves to bring to life new stories. And we're scouring the country and the world for that matter to try and bring new artifacts in that will help us illustrate these stories. This museum will never be about the stuff. It won't.
Yeah.
It is about the story.
Right.
But you use the stuff to bring the story to life.
Right.
And so we are always tapping into our creativity to find a way, because the museum is set up in a somewhat rigid nature, because it is told on a timeline of history. That timeline doesn't change that much.
Right.
And so every time I get ready to tell a new story, I typically have to tear something up, and so because there's not nearly enough space. When we left that little one-room office in 1990 and graduated to what we thought was a mega large space, you go from a one-room office to 10,000 square feet, you think, oh man, we got so much space. And now years later, you realize, oh, we don't have nearly enough space. and so every time I get ready to tell a new story, I have to tear something up. Most recently, we just added a beautiful addition called Barrier Breakers. And David, the Barrier Breaker exhibit chronicles all of the players who broke their respective major league teams' color barriers, from Jackie Robinson in 1947 through 12 years later, Boston being the last to complete the integration cycle when they signed Elijah Pumpsie Green. And as we so typically do in our society, we always celebrate the first guy. Yeah. We celebrated Jackie, and rightfully so. He was that pioneering first.
Right.
Larry Doby would break the color barrier in the American League just weeks after Jackie, and he's almost an afterthought.
Right.
That's how we are in our society. We always celebrate the first. We never remember the second. And in this case, if you're number 16, you can pretty much forget it. And so we just felt compelled that these players who went through the same trials and tribulations as Jackie, because I can tell you this with no level of uncertainty, it didn't get any easier for Pumpsie Green in Boston in 1959 than it did for Jackie in 1947. And so they all had their challenges as they were trying to blaze a path to play the game that they loved at the major league level. And so we just felt compelled that their stories deserve to be more than just a footnote in baseball history. So we've chronicled them all. And again, if we don't tell the story, who will?
Yeah.
And not only did we chronicle their stories, we also introduce our guests to what set the stage for integration.
Yeah.
And so if we were going to point to any one solitary event, it would be World War II. And World War II really created the impetus for integration in Major League Baseball. because you had this very strong sentiment of these young Black soldiers dying, fighting essentially the same racism in another country that they were being asked to
Right.
accept back here at home. And so this groundswell was really swirling now. If they can die fighting for their country, they ought to be able to play baseball in this country.
Yeah.
And that would ultimately lead to Branch Rickey signing Jackie Robinson away from the Kansas City Monarchs. So this is a beautiful exhibition that features some vitally pertinent information that most fans really don't know. And so we're so proud to make that available, thanks in large part to our friends at the Kauffman Foundation and Evergy for funding and helping underwrite this wonderful exhibit called Barrier Breakers.
And I will add to that, Bob, in that anyone who's watching this or listening to this who hasn't had the opportunity, whether you're from Kansas City or just passing through, or I think it's worth it to make a trip to Kansas City specifically to tour the Negro Leagues Museum, because it's, like I said, I learn something every time. It is a part of the society that I grew up in. It's part of the society that I live in now. And it is a very important thing. And we could spend hours listening to you tell stories of some of the players and why Jackie Robinson was the one who was chosen and all those things. And we're not going to take all that time because there's some other things I want to cover with you, but I just encourage people to make it. It's got to be on your bucket list. If you haven't been there already, it's got to be on the bucket list to go to the museum. One of the things that transitions to is an awful lot of Major League Baseball players have it on their bucket list. And when they come through to play the Royals in a non-pandemic season, they go to the museum. How gratifying is it for you and your staff to have so many Major League players come to the museum when they're in town to play a game?
Oh, extremely gratifying. You know, that's one of the things that we had wanted to do from the onset, was to create this level of outreach that would welcome current major leaguers into the fold here to learn about this history. And we kind of alluded to this early on. No sport holds to its history the way baseball does.
Yeah.
It is that one sport, David, where we consistently and constantly compare the stars of the past with the stars of today. And really, the romantic nature of our sport, whoever your favorite baseball player was when you were a kid, they're going to be your favorite baseball player the rest of your life. You know, and it's just not that way in the other sports.
Yeah.
And there's something very romantic about this. And so when young athletes come to the museum, and we've been seeing more and more and more of them through the years. Again, one of the things that I was so disappointed about this pandemic was the fact that we couldn't welcome these players this year, because with this year being the 100th anniversary of the birth of the Negro Leagues and all of the engagement from Major League Baseball and Major League Baseball's Players Association, I know that we would have seen a record number of current players as they were coming in to play the Royals stop in to see the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. And it never gets old for me, man. It really doesn't. I've kind of picked up the baton from Buck. We used to do this when he was still alive, and players would come out and he just would delight in it. And then I've kind of picked up the baton now, and I'm carrying that same level of energy and excitement every time one comes. And the thing that we talk about, the thing that they share with the players of the Negro Leagues, is love of the game.
Yeah.
You play this game because you love it. Now, I know as fans, sometimes we can be a little fickle because we equate everything in our society to money.
Yeah.
And so the fact that these players are afforded an opportunity to make a great living, we just naturally surmise that they don't love the game as much as the players of yesteryear. Of course they do. Yeah. You're still playing a game that you played for free as a kid. And quite frankly, if they had to play it for free, they would. Yeah. They would. So you don't lose the love of the game. They just are, again, afforded a wonderful opportunity to make a great living. But as I also share with them, you will never see a greater example of love of the game than you do when you walk through the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. You see, they had to love it in order to endure the things that they had to endure.
Right.
You know, it blows my young athletes away to even think about the fact that these players, David, could ride into a town, fill up the ballpark, and yet not be able to get a meal from the same fans who had just cheered them, or not have a place to stay.
Yeah.
So they would sleep on the bus and eat their peanut butter and crackers until they could get to a place that would offer them basic services. But they never allowed those social aspects, ramifications, adversity to kill their love of the game. Their mindset was, well, if I've got to sleep on the bus and if I've got to eat my peanut butter and crackers, then so be it. I'm going to keep playing ball. And that's what drives this story. That's what makes the museum so special.
Yeah.
It's not a woe is mine kind of story. These athletes never cried about the social injustice. They went out and did something about it.
Yeah.
And I think all of my young athletes embrace that. And I think they gain a much better perspective, number one, on just how good they have it. Because, sometimes you take for granted. We that's human nature. We take things for granted, and then it takes something else to help us gain perspective. And so some of the major league coaches will say, well, my guys were crying about a late night charter flight. A late night charter flight. And then you come in and you see this beautiful quote from the legendary Ted Double Duty Ratcliffe that says, every 4th of July, we would play 4 games in one day. I would pitch 2 and catch 2 and sleep 35 minutes in between games. All of a sudden, that late night charter flight don't seem so bad anymore.
Yeah, that's right.
So it is about perspective.
So which is more gratifying, to have players go through for the first time and just be wowed by the story and things like that, or to have players come back for repeat visits?
Wow. They're both special. They really are. And we've had a number of players who've come back for repeat visits. And what's so cool about it, David, is not only do they come back, they bring other players with them. That's when you know you've hit the mark. You've hit home, and so it's 6 in one hand, half a dozen in the other for me. But, anytime that you get a repeat performance, I think that's always significant, because that means that they felt what you had to offer to the point that they wanted somebody else to experience it with them. And we've seen that on many occasions through many of our great friends, particularly guys who now just recently retired, CeCe Sabathia, Torrey Hunter, Curtis Granderson, people like that who have been here multiple times and then would come back with, players and coaches from their respective teams whenever they came back to Kansas City. And they're still coming back. They're still coming back because they understand, particularly those players that I named, they understand that this is their legacy. Their roots are firmly anchored in this history. And if you are Black or of Hispanic descent, this is your Mecca. You don't play this game had it not been for the players in the Negro League. And David, there is no and, ifs, buts about it. You don't play. Right. So yes, do you owe a deed of gratitude? You absolutely do. But I don't hold the fact that most of them don't know this story. You don't know what you don't know.
Right.
And this story is not in the pages of history books. So unless you had somebody who sat you down and told you about it, you had no way to know. But then when you come here, I hope you grasp, exactly your place in this game. But if you are anything other than Black or Hispanic, and you come into this league, into this museum, you see the game in a different light.
Absolutely.
And every athlete can appreciate how good these players were in spite of the adversity that they had to face to play this game.
Well, you mentioned earlier that whoever was our favorite baseball player as a kid is still our favorite baseball player. For me, it's Hank Aaron.
We share the same favorite player.
I mean, it wasn't too long ago that I tried to figure out why he became my favorite player. And this was in the 60s. I was born in 1958. And I remember I lived in New York in the late 60s, and everybody was all about Willie Mays and what a great player he was and stuff. And he was so popular. He was the say hey kid. He was, bubbly and energetic and stuff like that. And then there was this guy named Hank Aaron who played in Atlanta and was quieter and didn't really like the media. So he wasn't out there. And I thought he's just as good a player. And I don't want to say I felt sorry for him, but I rooted for him because I wanted him to get the same credit. And then all of a sudden he's approaching Babe Ruth's record, and he has, he remains not only my all-time favorite baseball player, but my all-time favorite athlete. And I think it's spot on that baseball is just different. I mean, my first favorite Kansas City Chief was a guy named Chris Burford, who was a wide receiver in the early 60s. And, and I'm going to have Chris Burford on a podcast not too long from now. But he's no longer my favorite Chief. There might be some guy named Holmes who's getting that attention. Exactly. As much as I like the Royals today, it's still Hank Aaron is my all-time favorite baseball player.
And Henry Aaron was my favorite ball player. He was my childhood idol. And anytime that we were on the playground, all the kids knew who gonna be Hank Aaron. I'm Hank Aaron. Nobody else can be Hank Aaron. and he's also my favorite person that I've ever toured through this museum. Now, mind you, David, we've had American presidents, we've had first ladies, we've had all kinds of political dignitaries, entertainers, you name it. And with no disrespect to any of them, they're not Henry Aaron. And so, and that's the nature of it, man. He will always be my favorite Major League ball player. And in my mind, there will never be a baseball player better than Henry Aaron.
Yeah.
Even if they are better than Henry Aaron, they won't be in my eyes. Yeah. I will never admit it, and that's just the way that it was. And for me to tour him through the museum, man, was almost surreal. It is the only time in my career at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum that I've ever been starstruck.
Yeah.
And it's still, anytime I'm around him, I am reduced to that almost 12-year-old kid that circled the bases with him. I'm in my mother's living room in Crawfordsville, Georgia, 80 miles away from Atlanta Fulton County Stadium. When he hit record home run 715, he's circling the bases there in Fulton County Stadium. I'm circling the bases in my mother's living room, jumping for joy with my idol. And then I get to meet him and tour him. And man, I was a nervous wreck. Yeah, yep. And it was memorable moments for me ever. And like you said, he's one of my favorite athletes, one of my favorite people of all time. I don't know if people grasp what he had to endure as he was making that assault on Ruth's record. This black man in the South was about to break a record that nobody thought would ever be broken.
Right.
And people were not feeling this. He was getting death threats. His family had to be in hiding. And to be quite frank, he didn't know if he going to make it around the bases when he hit 715. And so, what was one of the most special moments in baseball history was one of the most difficult moments for him because he could never really enjoy it.
Yeah.
And it was 25 years later when baseball celebrated the 25th anniversary of him breaking Ruth's record. And that's what prompted the Royals to invite him to Kansas City. And they set up a tour of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. But it literally took him 25 years before he really got to celebrate what many believe to be the most prestigious baseball record, sports record of all time.
I'm reminded of Vin Scully's announcement or call. He said, "Imagine this: a black man is getting a standing ovation in the Deep South."
In the Deep South, so. Yeah. And my good friend Al Downing, who gave up home run 715, he handled that situation so beautifully. Yeah. A lot of people would go into a funk, for giving up a record like that. He understands his place in history as well. And to give up a home run to Henry Aaron is not like the worst thing in the world. There's some other guys that might have got a home run off of him. He's shaking his head like, how did this dude get a home run off of me? Yeah. And people forget, though, that Al Downing was a great pitcher. He really was. Yeah. 20-game winner. And so he will forever be linked to Henry Aaron. But as he said, there are a whole lot of worse guys that you could be linked to than Henry Aaron.
Yeah, I remember a little bit of the detail of that 7:15 home run. It was at 9:08 p.m. Off Downing, and Bill Buckner was the left fielder for the Dodgers that tried to catch the ball as it went into the bullpen, and it was caught by Tom House. So I remember a little bit of the detail, as I'm sure you do as well. Let's transition into what we talked about a little bit earlier in the difficulty of 2020. Not only did you have to shut down the museum to visitors for a while, and then you had to put the 100-year celebration of the founding of the Negro Leagues, from in 1920. Even when people could come back, you didn't have the interaction. What was the hardest part of the shutdown and all that went with it in 2020?
It was devastating. It really was. It was one of the darkest moments I can remember in museum history, and for me personally and professionally, because I love coming to this place. And this place has a lot of energy in it. And during that time that we were shut down from March 14th until June 16th, I would come in 2-3 times a week just to kind of keep the office going and do a little work. My staff was off. I could never step foot in the gallery though. Couldn't go in. Could not make myself go in there. I had never had that feeling before. And so I had to really kind of re-energize myself because, as you mentioned, the 100th anniversary was something that we were so excited about. Yeah. And when we started the year in February with this celebration, February 13th to be exact, which marked the actual 100th anniversary of the birth of the Negro Leagues, established right around the corner from my office at the Paseo YMCA. Andrew Root Foster will lead a contingent of 8 independent Black baseball team owners into a meeting that took place at the Paseo YMCA. And out of that meeting came the birth of the Negro National League. So we go right back into the very building that gave birth to this story. And we've got an all-star delegation, David. We've got the Commissioner of Baseball, Rob Manfred. We've got Xavier James, the Chief Operating Officer of Major League Baseball's Players Association, the Honorable Mayor Quentin Lucas, the great mayor of the city of Kansas City, 8-time Gold Glove winner, Kansas City Royal Hall of Fame, and now Jackson County Executive Frank White is there. John Sherman, our new owner of the Kansas City Royals, Lieutenant Governor Mike Kehoe, all gathered with me at the Paseo YMCA to commemorate this milestone celebration. You may recall that it was on that occasion that Major League Baseball and the Players Association announced a joint $1 million contribution to the museum in support of the museum and the 100th anniversary celebration. We roll out a year-long celebration plan. So we are off to a flying start. And less than 30 days later, everything came to a screeching halt. Yeah. Just like that. And I tell people, as a steward of this story, you can't wallow in self-pity. Right. That would be doing a complete disservice to all who call the Negro Leagues home. But I ain't gonna lie. Initially, I was doing a little wallowing, man, because, there was so much built into this year, so much riding on this 100th anniversary celebration. Even beyond the celebration itself, this was to be the springboard for a significant fundraising campaign, with a far-reaching goal to try and set up the museum for long-term sustainability. Right. To create an endowment for this organization so that it will be able to operate into perpetuity. And so you're literally watching your plans fall by the wayside. And there ain't a doggone thing really you can do about it. Right. We couldn't get group gatherings, together. It wasn't going to happen. So we killed all of those plans. And then at some point you say, okay, you got to figure something out here. You can't just let this milestone anniversary year just kind of vanish into thin air. And that's when I went to work and my team went to work and we came up with ideas like the virtual tip your cap to the Negro Leagues. As you well know, when we launched that campaign on June 29th, we launched it with 4 U.S. presidents tipping their cap in honor of the Negro Leagues, with President Obama, President Clinton, President Bush, and President Jimmy Carter all tipping their cap. General Colin Powell, athletes, transcending athletes like Michael Jordan and Magic Johnson, Billie Jean King, and just a host of others. And this thing literally went viral.
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden, the engagement around the 100th anniversary, the Negro Leagues and the museum was gaining some more momentum. When baseball did eventually return, we were going to do a national day of recognition. And when it did return, we went ahead with those plans, albeit with no fans not in the stands.
Right.
But on August 16th was the first time ever that all major league teams were honoring the Negro Leagues. They wore our commemorative patch on their uniforms. And that was a major milestone. And to see the level of engagement around the Negro Leagues and the museum that day was something that was amazing. It was unprecedented.
Yeah.
It was a 17-hour work day for me that day. I'll never forget it. I started at 5 a.m. that morning during the Korean interviews on the Korean Baseball League. Wow. And I think I did my last interview about 10 o'clock that night. And I was completely exhausted. But David, it was the most gratifying level of exhaustion I've ever experienced. And throughout the course of that day, my mind continued to reflect on my friend Buck O'Neill. And when I met him in 1993 for the very first time, at that time, I'm volunteering for the museum. One of the first questions I asked him was, what motivated you to want to build a Negro Leagues Museum? And what he said to me was very succinct, but also very profound. Vintage Buck O'Neill, so that we would be remembered.
Yeah.
And on that day, they were being remembered in ways in which I don't even know if Buck O'Neill could have ever imagined or dreamt. And so that was something that we took great pride in. And then, of course, the recent passage of legislation that will now give the Negro Leagues Museum a commemorative coin, a U.S. Mint commemorative coin to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Negro Leagues. That coin will be minted in 2022. A whole lot of prestige that goes into that. Very competitive. And in a contentious political year of a presidential election, to get bipartisan legislation through, it's difficult to get the Republicans and the Democrats to agree on anything.
Yeah.
And to be able to get this bipartisan legislation through is something that obviously we take great pride in. We have tip our cap to the likes of Representative Emmanuel Cleaver, Kansas City, Steve Stivers out of Ohio, Republican, Tim Kaine, Democrat, Senator Kaine, and of course, Senator Roy Blunt, Republican, who helped us get this passage of this legislation to get the more than 3/4 of Congress to sign off on it. And the coin, David, if we sell them through when they're minted in 2022, we could realize over $6 million
Wow.
from the sale of these coins. And so we're excited about that. And then that leads us to the end of the year where you get this historical announcement from Major League Baseball of its desire and decision to honor and recognize the Negro Leagues for exactly what they were, a major league. So in the midst of all these challenges this year, we found a way to win. And the word that comes to mind is resiliency. That is the hallmark of the Negro League.
Yeah.
Resiliency. And we had to embody that resilient spirit. And as I've said before, coronavirus, to use a bad baseball analogy, coronavirus was that big right-hander, nasty right-hander, who threw one high and tight and knocked us down. And what do? You got to get back in the batter's box. You got to dust yourself off, get back in the batter's box, and try to figure out how you're going to hit that sucker. And that's exactly what we've done this year.
Yeah.
And I am as proud of my team and what we've been able to accomplish. And let me say this before I forget. I also want to tip my cap to the thousands of people, individuals, who made donations to this museum in a year that was so challenging for everyone, yet they still found the wherewithal to support the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. Because in times of public health crisis, the major companies and foundations have to take care of people. You have to do that.
Yeah.
It's always people first. And so cultural institutions like ours can sometimes get pushed to the back burner. And we understand that. But man, there have been just, I mean, a legion of people who have made donations to help support the museum. And as a result, the museum has absolutely, weathered this first part of the storm. And we don't know if there's going to be part two of this storm or not. We hope that things are going to change. We don't know, but we feel very proud of what we've been able to accomplish this year.
There's one other thing that 2020 will be remembered for, I think, in a negative way. There are an awful lot of people who played a big role in baseball. And I'm thinking of people like Lou Brock and Bob Gibson and Joe Morgan and Chadwick Boseman. Is that the name of the guy who played Jackie Robinson in the movie?
Played Jackie Robinson.
Just talk about the impact that these legends, and you and I are friends on Facebook, and I see, your emotion when you post the loss of another star. Just talk about the impact of those players that they had on the museum.
Yeah, it hurts, David, every time that we lose one. And the thing that I've known for years is, number one, in the role that I am in, you experience a lot of death. The Negro League players, they were old when I met them, and we were already losing them at an alarming rate. This year, though, I've never seen as many legendary ball players pass away. Even before the Hall of Famers that we'll mention, the likes of Bob Watson, who had passed away earlier this year, who we presented the Jackie Robinson Lifetime Achievement Award to, and Jimmy the Toy Cannon Wynn, who was a mainstay here at the museum, many appearances here at the museum on our behalf. And then you mentioned the great actor, Chadwick Boseman, who brilliantly portrayed Jackie Robinson in the film 42. And we spent 2 amazing days with him in 2013 as we played host to what many recognize as the second largest screening of the film 42, only behind what took place in Hollywood. Well, that's a regular occurrence in Hollywood.
Yeah.
We don't get to do that often in Kansas City. And so it was on the red carpet that Chadwick, along with David Robinson and Thomas Tull, who owned Legendary Films, who produced the movie, presented me with the Kansas City Monarch jersey and cap that he wore in some of the opening scenes of the film.
Oh, wow.
That jersey and cap, of course, now proudly hangs inside the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. And he was just amazing the 2 days that we got to hang out with him, and the way he interacted with our team here, and his interest and genuine interest in the subject matter. And I could tell the way that Mrs. Robinson looked at him, that he had brought her late husband to life. See, she never called him Jackie. She called him Jack. And when she looked at Chadwick, you could tell that she saw Jack. And so, I mean, it was a beautiful thing to be a part of. He was such a talented young man. It hurts to lose him at 43, but what a tremendous body of work that he left us. When your first major breakout role, you play an icon in Jackie Robinson, and then he plays these other iconic figures in Thurgood Marshall and James Brown, to the point that he becomes a real life superhero with Black Panther. And so you go from playing an icon to becoming an icon. And so, that was a tremendous loss. And then you mentioned the fact of Lou Brock. Lou Brock was Buck O'Neill's surrogate son. So Lou spent many days here. And I had the honor of being invited by his wife, Jackie, to speak at Lou's funeral services. And it was indeed an honor. It was one of the most difficult things that I've ever had to do because of my affection and affinity for Lou Brock. And so one of the stories that I shared of Lou was when Lou set the all-time single season stolen base record, who was there to greet him? The legendary James Thomas Cool Papa Bell. Cool Papa and Lou had become great friends. Cool Papa mentored Lou when Lou first got to St. Louis, because Cool Papa was living in St. Louis. As a matter of fact, he lived and died in St. Louis. And so Cool Papa Bell is there to greet Lou. And so they had pulled up the bag, and so Cool's got the bag in his hand, and they give Cool the microphone, and Cool says, "Well, Lou, we're going to give you this bag because if we don't give it to you, you're going to steal it anyway.
Yeah. Cool Papa Bell, the guy who was so quick he could shut off the light and he could be in bed before the room gets dark.
That's the cool Papa Bell who told Lou things about base stealing and base running that Lou said he never heard before. He said, "Cool, I don't remember seeing this in the book." Cool Papa says, because it ain't in the book, And so we had such a great relationship. And then to lose Bob Gibson literally 2 weeks after Lou Brock passed away, Cardinal Nation, it was so extremely difficult to lose those two icons. And then our dear friend Joe Morgan. Yeah. Joe Morgan, David, in 2006, when Buck O'Neil passed away, left his playoff broadcasting duties to come to Kansas City to be the MC of Buck's public memorial service. He wrote his college thesis on the Negro Leagues. And so he was a dear friend of mine and the museum, and that was devastating news. And then more recently, the loss of Dick Allen, who we inducted into our Hall of Game, and who should absolutely be in the Hall of Fame. And our friend, the legendary country music singer Charlie Pride. A lot of people weren't aware that Charlie Pride had played in the Negro Leagues.
Yeah, I wasn't until I saw that on Facebook.
Yeah, Charlie Pride had been a good pitcher in the Negro Leagues who made his way into the New York Yankees organization before he hurt his arm. And it was only after he hurt his arm that he fell back on a pioneering country western music career some 70 plus million albums sold later. And as I tell my guests here at the museum, we should all have a fallback career like Charlie Pride. And Charlie was also one of the founding members of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. So he made many appearances here. And every time Charlie made an appearance at the museum, a guitar seemed to magically appear. Somebody always just happened to have a guitar, and he never ceased the opportunity to grab that thing and start an impromptu performance. And so, those losses, man, we will feel that. I still feel it. It hurts, but you try to cling to the great memories that you had with each of them. I just never remember seeing that much loss of legends as we've seen in 2020.
Yeah. I've known you for at least 10 years, maybe longer, and I've never seen you without a smile on your face. And I think you probably picked that up. Maybe it was always part of you. You picked that up from Buck. I'm going to ask you a question. It's probably going to bring some emotion to you. How did Buck O'Neil impact you?
Oh man, he has had as much influence on me as anyone. Probably with the exception of my father and a brother that I'm so close to. I'm the youngest of 6. And the middle son seemed to just embrace me and taught me so much about life, about social skills and dressing and everything. And I just wanted to be like my brother Fred. Buck O'Neil has had as much influence on me as anyone. And I just feel so blessed, David. And sometimes I ask myself, why me? This could have been anybody. Why was I put in this position to be around Buck, to learn from Buck? And the thing that I tell people all the time, the smartest thing that I ever did was I kept my mouth closed and I listened, because there was a lot of wisdom to be imparted if you wanted it. It wasn't forcing it on you. It was there if you wanted it. And I tried to absorb as much as I possibly could. And so the way that for me, I think I was always a people person. I've always been, from some time that I can remember. I come here from Georgia, get out to Park College. I didn't know a soul. It didn't take me long to make friends. So I've always had that in me. But to see how Buck told this story, how he could make people feel this story without necessarily wanting to run away from it, how he interacted with people, the way that people energized him. These are all things that I kind of try to embody. And particularly as I try to recount these stories and tell
Yeah.
these stories. I heard Buck tell these stories so many times. And David, it didn't matter if he told a story 1,000 times. If he was going to tell it to you, he was going to tell it to you like it was the first time
Yeah.
he ever told a story. He was never going to cheat you. And I've tried to take that on as well when I tell the stories. The only difference is that Buck lived those stories.
Yeah.
I'm just sharing the stories that I heard, but Buck lived those stories. But there is no greater compliment than when someone says, "You made me feel like I was there." When you can paint a picture with words,
Yeah.
I think that is very effective. And to me, as someone who takes pride in storytelling, that is the ultimate compliment. I felt like I was there.
Yeah.
And I think that's what Buck did so beautifully, is he made you feel like you were back in time and you could see Josh Gibson swinging that bat. And you could see the bravado of Satchel Paige on the mound. And I hope in the midst of all these stats being brought in and absorbed, that we don't lose
Yeah.
stories. The stories have to live on.
Yeah. And I want to wrap up with a couple of things here. We've talked about your personality, your constant smile. We've talked about your great storytelling. The other thing that I know that most people who know you or know of you think about is the fact that you are the best dressed man in Kansas City. And I wonder if that's, every time I come to the museum, I notice that people dress to the nines when they attended Negro Leagues baseball games.
Oh, yeah.
Is that why you do it, or you just like dressing up?
Well, and it's become part of the costume now. You know what I mean? Because this story, that was such an important part of the story. It has always been kind of important to me. My father was an impeccable dresser. Like I said, I'm the youngest of 6. They all dress. You emulate what you see.
Right.
And so that I think was inherently a part of who I was. And as I started to ascend in my job at the Kansas City Star, I always dressed. I felt like you needed to dress the part.
Yeah.
And then when I came here to the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, you certainly don't have to dress, but it feels like it just fits in with this story. So it is almost kind of making the experience a little bit more authentic for those. And I enjoy it. I absolutely enjoy it. I'm probably one of the few men that really kind of enjoy finding stuff to wear and the hats and everything that goes along with it. And so, and again, being around Buck and those guys who were always immaculately dressed, it just kind of fits the role for me.
Let's wrap up with this. What is, I know that the museum and Negro Leagues baseball, or the memory, will be celebrated. The centennial celebration will occur in 2021, even though it's a year late. Just talk about some of the things that will happen in 2021 to commemorate the 100th anniversary.
Yeah, well, we're going to roll out a new campaign called Negro Leagues 101. And so it is obviously aligns with the 101st anniversary of the Negro Leagues, but also think about the 101 classes from college. And David, those 101 courses were the only ones I passed, man. Because once we got to the 300, 400, 500 level, boy, I was in trouble. And so you better pad that GPA with those 100 level courses. And so next year is going to be this kind of ground sweeping educational outreach initiative for the museum. So if you can imagine a national 101 course that we hope a lot of people sign up for, where we're going to provide elementary information about the history of the Negro Leagues throughout the course of the year, various platforms, of course, that this will take place on, various programs that we'll launch, over the course of the year to help people learn about the history of the Negro Leagues. And so I'm excited about this because as much as we are our mission is to preserve and celebrate and illuminate, education is at the forefront of what we do. We are a teaching institution. And people really have, in general, not had great access to this story. It wasn't that they didn't want to know, they just had no way to know.
Right.
And so we are challenging ourselves to find ways, creative ways, to make this information readily available. And so we'll see how many people sign up for the course. And you know, if I'm grading, I'm gonna be grading on the curve anyway. But my
So will it be available online then for
yeah, it'll be a lot.
homeschoolers or
You know,
something like that?
We got 2 virtual reality projects that we're going to introduce next year. We've got some digital programs that we're creating right now. So a lot of this stuff will be online. There'll be things, you know, happening at the museum. But again, we still have to plan as if the virus is still going to continue to impact us. So we don't know if we're going to be able to do these larger group gatherings. But, you know, we will be able to create some unique experiences to help educate the masses about the history of the Negro Leagues, like I said, in a elementary fashion.
Yeah. All right. Well, my friend, it's always good to chat with you, to spend some time with you. I feel privileged to be able to do it one-on-one with you today. Thank you very much for joining us, and I'm looking forward to heading back down to the museum in the coming days.
Well, looking forward to seeing you, David. Thanks so much, man, for having me on the show.
All right.
Thanks for listening to Sports Connections with David Smale. Make sure to subscribe, follow, and rate the show from your favorite podcast platform. You can learn more about David Smale and his work by visiting davidsmalebooks.com. Don't forget to join us weekly for new episodes. Until next time.